Hi, I'm Perry Atkinson, General Manager here at theDove. Hey, check out our other videos and check out our website at thedove.us. Well, welcome back. What a delight to have in the studio with us again, our good friend, Dr. Daniel Tomlinson. He delivers a lot of babies.
That's right.
And that's his primary calling, but he also now has a tremendous lay ministry of writing and speaking. And he's written a series of books in the past, but I hold in my hand his new one, On the Road to Emmaus, Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And nice to see you. Congratulations.
It's great to be here.
Congratulations.
Well, thanks. It's a real blessing. And yeah, I've kind of departed. My other books were kind of medical, spiritual,
yeah.
You know, allegories in the Bible with obstetrical things, because
right.
I'm an obstetrician.
Yeah.
This book, it's like, you know, just going to depart from that and talk about what's interesting to me in the Bible. And
well, so your birth pains one was really interesting, yeah. Because you lived it. You've seen
right.
through your studies of the coming of Christ and the coming of a child.
Right. That birth pangs is an allegory.
Yeah.
That we're in the third trimester of a figurative pregnancy. So when I see pregnant patients, like, hey, where are they? The Old Testament is the first and second trimester. The birth is the second coming of Christ. The labor is the tribulation time frame, the book of Revelation, if you will. The rupturing of membranes is the rapture, the most dramatic, surprising event in a woman's pregnancy would be the rapture. So it kind of fits, and so I get to see that. You're right.
Well, what made you do this?
Well, you know, I thought I had written everything I wanted to in my two books, Birth Pangs and A Woman's Silent Testimony. And then a pastor that I respect a lot, 3 years ago, said, you know, how you doing, Dan? Well, you been writing anymore? And I said, well, no, I've written everything I wanted to say. My real calling is, you know, delivering babies. He goes, oh, you know, you're really a good writer. I think you should write some more. Well, you know, when a pastor talks to you, Perry, you kind of think, maybe this is from the Lord.
Yeah.
So I prayed about it for a little bit. I kind of started thinking it was. And so what interested me was Old Testament types. And so, okay, I started writing about that. About 3 years ago, I would write on weekends, on my days off, and got another book here.
Well, I was kidding around earlier. I said, when do you write? In between contractions?
No, I write on my days off. I'm a morning person, so I would write in the mornings, on Fridays and Saturdays generally.
So many people read quickly through the Old Testament. Those are old stories. I want to get into the New Testament. But you zeroed in on the Old Testament, and you were finding Christ not only in all the books, but basically in all the stories.
He's everywhere. You know, Christ told the Pharisees, the doubters, if you will, they said, search the scriptures because they speak of me. He wasn't talking about the New Testament. They didn't have the New Testament when he said that. He's talking about the Old Testament. You know, scholars call it the red thread, that he's the red thread throughout the Bible.
So did you approach with that in mind, or do you just pick, I mean, how did you start looking?
That's how I approached it. You know, the text for my book, you know, Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament, On the Road to Emmaus, is that story in Luke 24. Where the two men were, you know, the resurrection Sunday, Jesus had risen, he appeared to Mary, and then kind of disappeared, didn't he? And these fellows are walking to Emmaus, which is 7 miles away, and then the stranger comes up and says, well, you know, why are you upset? And they tell him the story, they give him the testimony about how they thought Jesus was the Messiah, but then he was crucified by the Romans, and the chief priests, you know, turned him over. They were like, you know, we don't understand this. And then they say, today's the third day, and our women who are among us have seen visions that he might be around. And then it says, Jesus said, you know, you fools and slow of heart, and he uses fools differently than we would. But to understand all the things that the scripture taught, it says beginning at Moses and all the prophets in the Psalms, he talked to him in all the scriptures, to them in all the scriptures of things concerning himself. So that must have been a crazy Bible study. And so this book is an attempt to just go, what was that Bible study like? You know, what did Jesus tell him? And that's what On the Road to Emmaus is. It's my take from being a Christian and studying the Word for a long time on what that Bible study was like.
All right, let's get into it a little bit. Other than Isaiah, who else speaks of Jesus?
Everybody does, but Moses speaks to him. You know, the 5 books of Moses are, you just start Genesis, Deuteronomy, Numbers, Exodus, all have pictures of Jesus. Isaiah, Zechariah, he has these 7 visions, and they talk about the story of salvation from from the first coming all the way to the second coming. Of course, Micah mentions him and tells us where the Messiah is going to be born. David, the sweet psalmist of Israel, his psalms are loaded with prophecies and pictures of Christ. Of course, Solomon and his Proverbs, and of course in being the wisest man in all of ancient, it's a picture of Christ and so forth. So the Old Testament speakers write about him, they picture him, they typify him quite a bit.
Any surprises when you were doing this?
Well, I broke the Bible or the story into 4 categories, and probably the biggest surprise was that there's songs that sing of Jesus. And the Song of Solomon, as I was studying, the Song of Solomon is just kind of sitting there in the Bible as, it's just a story of, marriage, a man and a woman. But there's a deeper picture, and it's a picture of Christ's love for the church, the shepherd king and his bride. So the Song of Solomon is a wonderful, it's a bestseller, and it talks about Jesus and his love for us.
All right, there's so many other, obviously you see Christ throughout of it. Did you discover a new appreciation for the, maybe the foreshadowing of salvation or of the cross?
Sure. I think that a lot of people wonder, I believe John 3:16 that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. I believe Romans 10:9 that if I confess Jesus the Lord and believe that God raised him from the dead, I shall be saved. But I haven't been that, maybe I'm messing up a little bit. I'm not, am I really going to go, or am I going to be left behind? Well, in all of these Old Testament stories, for instance, like the brazen serpent, the people were murmuring and complaining, so these snakes came and were biting in them, and they were dying and they were being destroyed. And so the people said to Moses, pray to God that, give us relief. So Moses prayed to God, and God said, I want you to make a brass serpent and lift it up, and whoever looks at this serpent will be saved, will be delivered.
Right.
Well, everybody who looked at this serpent was delivered, not just some of the people. And so the appreciation, I think, to answer your question, Perry, is that everybody comes through, whether they're saint and sinner alike, if you will, that, God's covers us, Jesus' blood covers us no matter what. Another example of that, before, not to belabor the point too much, would be the first trump. When the law was given in Exodus chapters 19 and 20, it says the trumpet sounded long and all the people came up. Not just some of the people of Israel came up, but they all came up, which is of course a picture of the rapture. It says that God descended on the mount, the people came up, and the trumpet was sounding. That's Thessalonians 4, if there ever was,
right,
where you hear the voice of the child and then trumpet. In fact, whenever trumpets are in the Old Testament, it's talking about the rapture, actually. But everybody came up. And so the appreciation, to answer your question, I get excited just thinking about it, is that
good.
Everybody's included. Everybody that's in that ship of salvation, if you will. And there's another example, Noah's Ark, he was in that ship, and as long as he stayed in the ship, he was saved from the waters of destruction. So I could go on and on about how the Old Testament pictures salvation.
Did you think you'd see that when you approached this, to do this? You knew you were looking for Jesus and everything, but you obviously picked up some more excitement.
It's like the pastor who's preaching. As you preach, you get more revelation. And so, I guess I kind of thought I knew this stuff before I started writing the book, but as you write, you get more and more insights all the time. And I think that is the one, is that everybody gets included.
I also hear a little bit of a heart of an evangelist here. You want to tell everybody?
I don't think I have the gift of evangelism, but I do. I do want to tell people about Jesus and the Word. I have the personality that I can't just go up and say, do you know Jesus?
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think I've learned that if you treat everybody like they're already a Christian, you can kind of evangelize them right into the kingdom. So that's a technique that I use, is that everybody I talk to, I think of them as already a Christian, and I'm just talking about the Lord just like you and me are just talking now.
Okay. All right, the book is called On the Road to Emmaus, Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament. Tate Publishing, where is it available? Is it available at the bookstores?
Well, you can get it through Tate Publishing. It probably a less expensive way would be to go to Amazon.com.
Okay.
Now I have a website, drdantomlinson.com,
okay,
that has links. So I would encourage everybody to go to drdantomlinson.com.
drdantomlinson.com and get a copy. We're going to take a break. I have a big question for him when we come back. Okay, we're back, and what an honor to have with us this morning in the studio with us, Dr. Daniel Tomlinson. He's authored his new book called On the Road to Emmaus, Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament. Now, first of all, you can go to his website, Dr. Dan Tomlinson. That's drdantomlinson.com. Get the book there. He will be at Evangel tomorrow from 1 to 3 signing books. So you can go to the mall tomorrow and meet Dr. Dan, talk to him, get a autographed copy. By the way, sign that one. And get a copy of the book. That'll be tomorrow at Evangel. And then this weekend, you're speaking at Calvary Chapel in Grants Pass.
Right. Yeah. The pastor's off.
Denny Stahl there.
Right. Little ministry that I have where I've got some PowerPoint talks that I give, and it's a little different flavor. I'm a doctor, so I kind of speak from the doctor angle, and doctors love PowerPoint. Preachers may be a little different, so it's probably more of a teaching than a preaching. But I've been well received. The folks get turned on when I teach, and so it's a little ministry that I'm thankful to the Lord for.
This is great. Anyway, so check it out tomorrow at Evangel from 1 to 3 there at the Rogue Valley Mall. All right, Dr. Dan, if Jesus is so clear in the Old Testament, in all of those books, and yet all of the stories, why don't the Jews see it?
Big question, and not the truth. Well, it says, Paul tells us in Romans that the Jews are blinded until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. So we know from the Word that there's kind of a spiritual thing going on with the Jews. They have an explanation for every one of those prophecies. Let's talk about Isaiah 53, where it's the suffering serpent. He's wounded for our iniquities. They say that that's the nation of themselves. They've got an explanation for everything. And so all of these principles in the Old Testament, because the Old Testament, we talked about the red thread, that Jesus is in the Old Testament as kind of hidden, the story of Rahab and the
the bloodline of Jesus is kind of interesting.
Yeah, it totally is. Yeah. So, but it's hidden in a way. It's been said that the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And so they've got an explanation for everything. And they say that the suffering serpent is, for instance, is the nation of Israel itself.
All right, so it is an event yet to occur when the scales drop off, right?
Imagine how the early disciples felt, though. Here they are, they're all Jews, and they, now they're Messianic Jews, and they see all these things. Jesus is explaining to them these things in the Old Testament. They must have been so turned on that first 100 years, where we talk about the church at Ephesus, that early church, how they loved the Lord. It was a love relationship. And I'm sure part of it was because the Old Testament, they saw all these things in the Old Testament that spoke of Jesus.
We have a tendency to read the Old Testament for promises and apply it to us. Sometimes we're taught when you see the word Israel, put your name in there.
Yeah.
But if you do that, you could miss the Jesus factor.
Well, you totally could. Now, Israel means governed by God. So I think there's some legitimacy to it. You see an Old Testament promise, and you go, okay, does that fit with the flow of the Word? And if it does, then I think you can claim it. But there's other times that it probably is just talking to Israel. Israel, until 1948, people would see these prophecies about Israel, and they go, must be talking about the church because Israel doesn't exist. But bam, Israel comes around in 1948, and now, all the eschatology folks are going, maybe there's something to this thing about Israel coming back as a nation.
All right, so where did you see Jesus in Leviticus? When not eating
Leviticus. Well, I can tell you, the first 5 chapters you have the 5 offerings, the burnt offerings, the meal offerings, the peace offering. All of those are pictures of Jesus, and they're in the book.
Wow.
They talk about Jesus because they're voluntary sacrifices. Some of them are male and unblemished, for instance. There's Jesus. Some of them are offered north of the temple, for instance, Calvary.
Yeah. Wow.
So he's in Leviticus.
Okay, he's in Leviticus. Did you discover any new ones for yourself?
Oh, this book just scratches the surface. I was just thinking just today, of the last trumpet and the first trumpet. The whole giving of the law is a picture of Jesus and the second coming, but it's not in the book because there's all kinds of things that aren't in the book that speak of Jesus. Jesus is almost every page. This is only a 200-page book.
Wow. Any additional prophecies you discovered as far as his crucifixion that you discovered?
Okay, well, the Psalms, Psalm 22, and Psalm 69 talk about the crucifixion. The story of David and Goliath is a picture of the crucifixion, where David takes on Goliath and then defeats him in an unlikely way, and then takes his sword and cuts off his head. You go, how's that a picture of the crucifixion? Because it took the tool of the enemy and killed him. And the tool of the enemy in the crucifixion is the Roman crucifixion. And Jesus did an unexpected thing, and then he took that death that we deserved. And Satan, how madly incensed he must have been when he found out 3 days later that Jesus isn't in the tomb. I mean, it's that proto-evangelicalism of Genesis chapter 3, and that you're going to wound his heel and he's going to crush your head. And that Satan must have thought he beat the rap when he killed the Messiah. I mean, it's kind of like C.S. Lewis's book of, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where the lion, gives his life, right, and then he comes back. How mad Satan must have been. I just think about that. It's like, ooh, he didn't get it. It says in Corinthians that he wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory had he known that there'd be a bunch of little Christians running around that have Christ in us, the hope of glory.
Did you discover anything that deals with the second coming of Christ?
Second coming is in the Old Testament all over the place. For instance, whenever you hear trumpets in the Old Testament, it's talking about the rapture and the second coming. So when the trumpet sounded long, when they were given the law, and it says that God descended over the mountain and the people came up. Then you have the two trumpets of silver, and silver is a picture of redemption in the Old Testament. And they would blow the trumpets for the convocation of the nation, for their solemn assemblies, for going to war, and there's one other thing that they would blow the trumpets for. Those are all the pictures that you see in the second coming, where it says in Thessalonians that you hear the voice, the shout, and the trump of God, and then that who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them and meet the Lord in the air. Of course, the trumpet judgments, for instance, in the book of Revelation. So the Old Testament and the second coming are in there too. In fact, the Old Testament, we talk about Jesus in this book, but it pictures principles in the New Testament all over the place.
Such as?
Let me give you an example.
Okay.
Sending away the flesh. Remember the story of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael. And Abraham was told to send her away with no provisions other than some mealy bread and some water. And then Paul tells us in the New Testament that that's an allegory, how we're supposed to send away the flesh, for instance. So the Old Testament principles are there. Another story would be in Judges chapter 6, where you see the story of Jabin, who's a general of the Canaanites or the Syrians. And they take on Barak and Deborah. And Deborah tells Barak to take him on and with all his chariots. And then they defeat Sisera and Jabin. But then Sisera runs to the tent of Jael, who is a Kenite, and it says that she pounded a stake in her head. And the stake, of course, is a spike of the crucifixion, and the hammer is the word, and that's sending away the flesh. Jabin is a picture of the flesh, for instance. So there's some really deep stuff. God's word is simple. I mean, confess Jesus is Lord and believe that God raised him from the dead, and thou shalt be saved. But it's also super deep.
Wow.
And there's pictures everywhere because his ways are higher than our ways.
I mentioned earlier this morning, the only time I've ever heard a sermon of Jesus being depicted in all 66 books was the late Oral Roberts. He actually got up,
really,
and he took all 66 books and by memory, I might add.
That guy's amazing. I would believe that.
Yeah, and he would say what Jesus was in every book of the Bible.
Right on.
And it's quite a deal.
Yeah.
Do you think this will lead you over into the New Testament?
That's a good thought. That's a good thought. The New Testament is, kind of written to us.
A little bit more profound there.
Yeah, and they're love letters to us. But yeah, I think that's a good point. You're giving me food for thought too.
All right, now you come to the end of the Old Testament and then the 400 years of silence. How do you process that in your head?
400 years of silence. Well, they were. That's a great question. You kind of stumped me there.
No, but I mean, 4 in the Bible is the number of testing, and 40 days, 40
right.
On all those things. But you go into the 400 and you think, all right, so the Old Testament ends and the New Testament begins, but there's this gap there. And it's kind of like God went quiet for 400 years.
He did, but he didn't. I mean, during that time frame, you had
He gave us this with all the Jesus markings.
Right, but then those 400 years, you had problems. You had the Greeks take over, and Antiochus, the guy who, and then the Maccabees, revolted against him, and so we have Hanukkah that happened during those 400 years. Of course, Jesus alluded to Hanukkah at the Feast of Dedication several times. So things were happening, even though we don't have scriptures from it. It's still, I think, a spiritual time for the nation, especially with the Maccabees, in 100 BC or so.
All right, so why is it important? I mean, I'm going to maybe answer my own question, but why is it important for Christians to see Jesus in the Old Testament, from your perspective?
I think that if you see Jesus in the Old Testament, it brings the New Testament alive, because we talked about that he's everywhere in the Bible. Obviously the New Testament's written to us. Those are letters from God to us, telling us, doctrine, reproof, and correction, if you will. In fact, it says all Scripture is given for doctrine, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be thoroughly perfected. But the Old Testament is kind of more subtle at that. It kind of talks about rules and regulations, so that not only can we're saved by faith and not of works, but we're created for good works. It says right after that where it talks about we're saved by faith, but we're created for good works that we could walk in. That Old Testament kind of gives us this kind of guidance. And no, we don't have to. We're crucified to the law. But let's say I don't follow the law. There's going to be repercussions. So the Old Testament is important, even though that we're not under the Old Testament rules and regulation. It's still critical part of our life, I think.
Well, and I think another part of this is that I think so often Christians are taught to read the Old Testament for history, and that's certainly fine.
Right.
But have you ever read the Old Testament to look for Christ in it?
It's not just rules and regulation.
Right.
It's not just Jewish history, but it's singing about Jesus.
All right. The book is entitled On the Road to Emmaus, Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament. Dr. Dan will be at Evangel tomorrow from 1 until 3. That's Evangel there in the Rogue Valley Mall for a book signing. And then Sunday, he'll be speaking at the Calvary Chapel there in Grants Pass, filling in for Pastor Denny Stahl. So you may want to check that out if you're in the Grants Pass area.
Yeah, 9 and 11 are the services that day.
9 and 11, okay. One last, and this isn't fair, I got 30 seconds. Going back to your birth pains, where do you think we are in the timeline of birth pains and the coming of Christ?
We're late in the third trimester. If you look at Genesis, from the time from Adam is 6,000 years. So each trimester is 2,000 years. The third trimester started when those two angels said that Jesus that you saw leave, he's going to come back the same way. That was the beginning of the third trimester. We're toward the end of it now.
All right, you may want to pick up that book too. Good to see you. Congratulations, man.
Totally my pleasure.
Let's do it again, okay?
Okay.
All right, we'll see you next time on Focus Today.